In September of 1990, a road crew working beside Interstate 40 in North Carolina made a discovery that would haunt investigators for more than 3 decades. Hidden down an embankment near the New Hope Church Road exit were the remains of a young woman. Nobody knew her name or where she had come from. The only clue that seemed remotely distinctive was the clothing that she was wearing, a pink sweatshirt decorated with 3 cartoon rabbits, 2 riding bicycles and 1 riding a unicycle. Investigators hoped somebody would recognize it, that somebody would come looking for the woman. Perhaps a friend, perhaps a family member, even somebody who had simply seen the young woman shortly before she met her end. But nobody came forward. On September 19, 1990, maintenance workers were carrying out routine duties near Interstate 40 in Orange County, North Carolina. The area sat close to the New Hope Church Road exit, a stretch of highway used by thousands of drivers every day. At some point during their work, the crew noticed something unusual down a nearby embankment. When authorities arrived, they discovered the remains of a mysterious young woman. Investigators believed she had been there for several days, possibly as long as a week or 9 days. The location immediately raised questions. Although the site was positioned near a busy interstate, the area where the woman was found was concealed enough that passing motorists would have had little chance of noticing her. Detectives quickly began documenting every detail they could. The woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s. She stood between approximately 5 feet 3 inches and 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed around 110 to 115 pounds. She had brown or strawberry blonde hair with lighter highlights, and investigators noted that she had previously undergone an appendectomy. She bore the scar on her midriff. They also found evidence of quite a lot of dental work, including several fillings. There was also signs that she needed some more dental work carrying out, and this could suggest a change in circumstances for her towards the end of her time. Yet none of those details helped answer the most important question. Exactly who was she? Among the items recovered from the scene was a bracelet and a ring. She was also wearing white socks. What drew the most attention, however, was a pink sweatshirt featuring 3 cartoon rabbits. 2 of the rabbits appeared to be riding bicycles, while the third rode a unicycle. It was an unusual design. It could be exactly the kind of detail that investigators hoped would generate leads. If somebody recognized the sweatshirt, they might recognize the woman. If they recognized the woman, they might finally have a name. There was also another detail that puzzled investigators. Although the woman was wearing socks, her shoes were missing. Even more unusual was the condition of the socks themselves. Reports indicated they were remarkably clean. Over the years, that small detail would generate considerable discussion among both investigators and amateur sleuths. Had the shoes simply been lost somewhere before the woman was discovered? Had somebody removed them? Or did the missing footwear point towards something more significant? At the time, there was no way to know. The investigation was only beginning. And before detectives could identify a suspect, they first needed to identify the victim herself. The problem was that nobody seemed to know who she was. As investigators worked to identify the young woman, they quickly discovered they were facing an unusually difficult case. There was no identification at the scene, nor were there any missing persons reports that immediately matched her description. So, was this young lady even being missed by anyone at all? There was also no obvious connection to Orange County. In fact, detectives were not even certain whether she was from North Carolina where she was found. The location she was discovered at only complicated matters further. Interstate 40 stretches across multiple states and serves as a major transportation route. If the woman had been transported there, she could have come from almost anywhere. Investigators began pursuing every lead they could find. They interviewed potential witnesses. They also reviewed missing persons reports from North Carolina and beyond. Descriptions of the victim circulated to law enforcement agencies across the country. Nothing produced a positive identification. There were some glimmers of hope appearing, though. One potentially promising lead came from reports of a young woman seen in the days before the discovery. Witnesses described someone who appeared similar to the victim and who may have been traveling through the Burlington area. Some reports suggested the woman may have been walking near major roadways and truck stops. However, investigators were never able to conclusively prove whether the sightings involved the victim. As the months passed, the case grew colder. Detectives turned to forensic artists in the hope that a visual reconstruction might finally generate answers. Using the victim's skull, specialists created a facial reconstruction designed to approximate what she may have looked like in life. The reconstruction was distributed publicly. Investigators hoped that somebody would recognize the face. Perhaps an old friend would see it, or a relative would recognize familiar features. Or maybe somebody who had lost contact years earlier would now finally realize what had happened. But nobody came forward. The reconstruction generated attention, but not identification. Years later, as technology improved, investigators tried again. Digital artists created updated illustrations based on the original forensic work. There were now multiple artists' impressions of what the woman could have looked like. Some digital, some hand-drawn, and some were painstakingly built using clay. These images were distributed online and shared through social media. Once again, detectives hoped that modern technology would succeed where earlier efforts had failed. Once again, though, the trail went nowhere. The woman still remained unidentified. During this period, she became known by several different names. Some investigators referred to her as the I-40 Jane Doe or the Hillsborough Jane Doe. Others called her the New Hope Jane Doe because of the nearby road exit. Some simply called her Hope. But regardless of the nickname, the reality remained the same. The woman in the rabbit sweatshirt still had no name. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was how distinctive some of the evidence appeared to be. The rabbit sweatshirt seemed memorable, as did the bracelet. The circumstances seemed memorable too. Yet year after year, nobody recognized the woman. At some point, investigators even attempted to trace the origins of the sweatshirt itself. The design featured 3 cartoon rabbits and appeared unusual enough that somebody might remember where it had been sold. Researchers eventually linked the artwork to illustrator Jim Benton and a clothing company called Sportsweats. The design had reportedly been distributed through retailers across the United States during the 1980s. While this answered questions about the sweatshirt, it did not answer questions about the woman wearing it. The discovery ultimately led nowhere. As the years passed, investigators followed hundreds of leads. Each one seemed to offer a possibility. Each one eventually ended in disappointment. The case gradually transformed from an active investigation into one of North Carolina's most enduring mysteries. By the time the case reached its 3rd decade, many people had begun to wonder whether the young woman would ever get her name back. Meanwhile, investigators were beginning to examine another possibility. What if identifying the victim was only part of the mystery? What if the person responsible for leaving her beside Interstate 40 had already appeared on law enforcement's radar years earlier? As investigators continued searching for answers, attention occasionally turned toward individuals whose crimes appeared to share similarities with the case. One of those individuals was a taxi driver named Keith Allen Brown. Brown became known to law enforcement after being connected to violent crimes involving women in North Carolina during the same period. The timing immediately attracted attention. Lisa's remains had been discovered in September of 1990. Around that same time, Brown was operating as a taxi driver in the region. Authorities began examining whether there could be any connection. What drew attention was not just geography. It was also the circumstances surrounding some of Brown's known crimes. Investigators noticed certain similarities involving vulnerable women, roadside locations, and the disposal of victims. Some reports indicated that Brown was questioned about the Orange County case. However, no public evidence ever emerged, proving that he was responsible. Authorities never announced charges against him in connection with the murder. Brown reportedly neither admitted nor denied involvement when questioned. As a result, investigators were left with another possibility rather than a definitive answer. The theory remained exactly that, a theory. Even so, the similarities were difficult to ignore. Another detail that attracted attention involved location names. One of Brown's known victims was discovered near a road called Mount Hope Church Road, and this unidentified woman had been found near New Hope Church Road. The similarities were striking enough that people discussing the case continued to bring them up years later. Yet similarities alone are not evidence. Investigators still needed solid proof, but that proof never arrived. As the years passed, other theories emerged. Some researchers focused on the missing shoes, others focused on witness sightings, others examined possible links to traveling offenders who used interstate highways. But every theory shared the same problem. Nobody knew who the victim was. Without a name, detectives were trying to solve a puzzle while missing half the pieces. The victim's entire life remained a blank page. They did not know where she had lived, who her friends were, or who she had been spending time with before her life came to an end. They did not even know which state she called home, and until those questions were answered, identifying a suspect would remain extraordinarily difficult. For decades, that reality kept the case frozen in place. Then, in 2020, a new investigator took over, and hidden inside the evidence collected 30 years earlier was a tiny fragment that would change everything. By 2020, the case had already frustrated generations of investigators. The woman in the rabbit sweatshirt had remained unidentified for nearly 30 years. Hundreds of leads had been exhausted. Multiple forensic reconstructions had failed, and public appeals had failed too. Even advances in technology had failed to produce a breakthrough. Then investigator Dylan Hendricks took over the case. Like many cold case investigators, Hendricks faced a difficult question. What evidence still existed that previous investigators had not been able to fully utilize? The answer turned out to be remarkably small. Among the evidence preserved from the original investigation was a degraded hair fragment. For decades, it had remained largely useless. When the woman was discovered in 1990, DNA technology was still in its early stages. Investigators could use DNA to compare known individuals against evidence. What they could not do was use it to identify an unknown victim who had no known relatives in the system. 30 years later, that situation had changed dramatically. Hendricks submitted the hair fragment for modern DNA testing. The sample was sent to Astrea Forensics, a laboratory specializing in difficult forensic extractions. And despite the age and condition of the evidence, scientists successfully recovered a usable DNA profile. For the first time in decades, investigators had a realistic path toward identifying the victim. The next step involved forensic genealogy. Rather than searching for the victim directly, investigators searched for people who might just be related. Forensic genealogist Leslie Kaufman joined the investigation and began analyzing the DNA profile. Using genealogy databases and family tree research, Kaufman gradually started identifying potential relatives. The process was slow and painstaking. Every branch of a family tree had to be examined. Every possible connection had to be verified. Eventually, investigators identified individuals who appeared to be paternal cousins of the unidentified woman. That discovery gave detectives something they had never possessed before, a clear direction. Investigators began interviewing family members. As they worked through the family tree, a pattern began to emerge. There was one name that kept appearing, one relative who seemed to fit exactly where the DNA suggested she should be. Yet nobody seemed to know where she had gone. Years earlier, she had simply just disappeared from the family. Later, Hendricks would describe the discovery in a phrase that became widely quoted. He explained that there was a Lisa-shaped hole in the family tree, exactly where the DNA suggested the victim should be. Investigators then obtained additional DNA from a maternal relative. The comparison provided the final confirmation they needed. After more than 30 years, the woman in the rabbit sweatshirt finally had a name. She was not a Jane Doe. She was not Hope. She was not the unidentified woman beside Interstate 40. Her name was Lisa Coburn Kesler. And as investigators began learning about her life, they realized the identification had answered one mystery, while creating several more.
Investigators in Orange County have been working for more than 3 decades to identify a murder victim, and now, thanks to new technology, they have.
It's a big update. WREL's Grace Holland joins us now with this story. Grace, talk about what led to this discovery.
Lena and Chris, DNA was still very new science back in 1990 when road crews found a woman's body along I-40 East near New Hope Church Road. At the time, they made this reconstruction based off of her skull, but they still wouldn't know for decades that it was 20-year-old Lisa Kesler. It's believed someone strangled her to death. Back then, detectives relied on witnesses and missing persons reports. They created digital pictures like this of her a few years later when that technology came along, but sharing it on social media never brought them any leads. The sheriff says now the focus will shift to hopefully finding Kesler's killer. Of course, there is no statute of limitations on murder.
When authorities publicly announced the identification in September 2023, one mystery was finally solved. The young woman found beside Interstate 40 had been Lisa Coburn Kesler. She always had been. She was 20 years old when her life came to an end. She had spent most of her life in Jackson County, Georgia. Almost immediately, investigators began trying to reconstruct the missing chapters of her life. What they discovered was quite unusual. Lisa had family connections in both Georgia and Michigan. At some point before her death, different branches of her family had come to different conclusions about where she was living. Family members in one location believed she had gone elsewhere. Family members elsewhere believed she had returned home. As a result, nobody realized she was missing at all. It is one of the most remarkable and disturbing aspects of the entire case. Poor Lisa was seemingly never even missed by her own family. For more than 3 decades, investigators searched for a missing woman who had never officially been reported missing. The identification also led to another discovery. After Lisa's name became public, a journalist in her hometown located high school yearbook photographs that investigators themselves had been unable to find. For the first time, the public could finally see the face behind the mystery. The woman in the reconstruction was now a real person. She had a name and now had a history too. She had people who remembered her. Yet many questions remained unanswered. Sheriff Charles Blackwood made a particularly interesting comment while discussing the case. Without revealing specific details, he described Lisa's life as very complex. Exactly what he meant by that has never been fully explained, but I hope one day it is. I feel like the sheriff has clickbaited us with that one. The statement immediately attracted attention because it suggested investigators had learned far more about Lisa's background than they were prepared to disclose. The sheriff also revealed something else. Investigators had identified a person of interest they intended to interview. More intriguingly, he stated that the individual had been interviewed before. Exactly when that interview occurred and what relationship the person may have had to Lisa was not disclosed. The announcement raised a new series of questions like, had investigators unknowingly spoken to somebody connected to the case years earlier? Had identifying Lisa suddenly caused old evidence to make sense? Or had her newly reconstructed life pointed detectives towards somebody they had previously overlooked? Authorities have not publicly provided those answers. What they have said is that the investigation remains active. For the first time in decades, detectives are no longer trying to identify the victim. They are trying to identify the person responsible. The mystery that began in September of 1990 is not over, but at least Lisa finally has her name back. Thank you so much for watching. I'm uploading daily true crime and dark content here on this channel, so make sure that you're subscribed, hit like on the video, and also drop a comment so you get shown more of my stuff.